I think we've all heard of, and probably most of us have seen the movie, All Dogs Go to Heaven. And while the book of Ecclesiastes doesn't really deal specifically with that topic, there's a passage we're about to read in the very last part of chapter 3 that leads some people to maybe land on that conclusion. We read in Ecclesiastes 3, beginning at verse 18, that Solomon says, "I said in my heart concerning the conditions of the sons of man, God tests them, that he may see that they themselves are like animals. For what happens to the sons of men also happens to animals. One thing befalls them, as one dies, so dies the other. Surely they all have one breath. Man has no advantage over animals, for all is vanity. All go to one place, all are from the dust, and all return to the dust." Let's stop right there for just a moment before we read the conclusion of the chapter and make a couple of observations and comments. As you read this text, we don't need to end up with the conclusion, which is an erroneous conclusion, that man and animals both have a soul and man and animals are both equal in the sight of God. Now, the text says that man has no advantage over animals, but it's in the context of the fact that both men and animals die. Both of them, have breath, and both cease to live, both die. Man, though, has a very distinct advantage over animals in the fact that he is made in the image of God. Animals are not said to be made that way. And so man has a soul, animals do not. And yet we also see that just as man returns to dust, animals also return to dust. Those are two very common things that happen to men and animals. And yet verse 21 tells us that there is something different, though, after breath ceases, after death. And in verse 21 it says, "Who knows the spirit of the sons of men which go upward, and the spirit of the animal which goes down to the earth?" The implication there is that when man dies, he goes upward, which seems to be symbolic of heaven, and animals go down to the earth. In other words, they cease to exist. You continue reading that Solomon says, "So I perceive that nothing is better than that a man should rejoice in his own works, and that is his heritage, for who can bring him to see what will happen after him?" Of course, Solomon is writing that from a perspective without the whole knowledge of eternity, and yet we understand by looking at the entire Bible and having much more information than Solomon did, that we do know what happens to man after he dies. And because the text also tells us that man goes upward, we're reminded of Colossians chapter 3, verses 1 through 3, where it tells us to seek the things that are above, to set our mind on things that are above and not on the earth. We seek what is upward. We seek God.